So, good morning. It's great to be here. I enjoyed yesterday a lot, lots of interesting talks. Looking forward to more later today, but first it's me. So my name is John Pascoe. In my day job, I'm an assistant professor at Delft University of Technology in the Faculty of Aerospace Engineering. And I study how damage grows and evolves in the stuff we make airplanes out of. So none of that is relevant for today, because today I'm here as a gamer who's interested in history. And when you think about history and games, there's a couple of usual suspects that come up, right? So you have your games set in a specific period of history, so Assassin's Creed, Plague Tale, Kingdom Come, so on, you can think of many more. You have games that are about guiding a certain entity through historical processes, so Europa Universalis, Civilization, Old World, Victoria, many more. And you have games that are set in our contemporary time, but are about interacting with cultural heritage, and often in the form of looting or blowing up said cultural heritage. Uncharted, Tomb Raider, and other Indiana Jones simulators. Today, I want to talk about a different category of games, namely games that are not usually marketed or thought of as historical. And I want to talk about one game in particular, which I've already spoiled, and my title is Microsoft Flight Simulator. As you may or may not be aware, Flight Simulator is actually a very old game franchise, with the first edition coming out in 1982, and that looked like this. So since then we had multiple iterations. Up to 2006 we had Flight Simulator X for 10. Then we had a gap of 14 years, and then in 2020 we had the release of Microsoft Flight Simulator, because why keep counting? They reset the numbering, as any good reboot. But throughout all these iterations, the basic gameplay has remained the same. The basic gameplay has always been the free flight mode. The concept is very simple. Pick an aircraft, pick a departure spot, weather conditions, time of day, and go fly. No goals. If you switch off the crash detection, there's no failure states. It's just about flying. And whether you just want to buzz around your local airfield a couple of times or fly all the way to Tokyo, up to you. So, how does that lead to history? Well, before we can understand that, let's see what do we actually see when we press the fly button. Well, what we see is the world. Our world. Because one of the cool innovations of the latest edition of Microsoft Flight Simulator is that it live streams data from Bing Maps, which is like Google Maps, but then more Microsoft. And Bing Maps have a global database of aerial and satellite imagery, and this is streamed into the game, allowing you to fly over the real world, right? One-to-one recreation. Now, this imagery is really great, but the downside is it's two-dimensional, it's flat. When you have mountains like this, it's okay, because you can overlay the imagery over a digital elevation model, but for things like buildings or trees, you have to get a bit more creative. Which is what Microsoft and the actual devs of the game, which is Asobo Studios, and their partners have done. They take in this data from Bing, they run it through various AI algorithms, they also merge it with other data sources, and identify, hey, at this location on the imagery, there's a building. And they can even kind of identify what kind of building. And they have a library of generic assets, divided up by region and building type, and they place these generic assets onto the imagery. To make that more concrete, this is Leiden. If you have a mental map of Leiden, you should be able to more or less recognize it, and you are able to identify that certain 3D objects here represent specific buildings in the real world. If you actually know what the building looks like, you also recognize it doesn't match. Especially, you might notice that the hospital seems to have lost some stories of its building. But you can at least understand what it's supposed to represent. The footprint of the building is correct, the architectural style kind of matches, so it's quite a plausible recreation, but with room for improvement. And there are spaces in the world where Microsoft actually fills in that room for improvement, because Microsoft, for certain regions, has access to photogrammetry data. So three-dimensional recreations based on aerial photography. For example, in Rome. So here we see Rome, we see the famous monuments, there are more than the ones I just pointed out, but also all the buildings in between those monuments are one-to-one 3D reconstructions of the real-world building based on this aerial photography. From up here, that looks great, but if we get down into the weeds, we can recognize that photogrammetry still has some limitations in terms of accuracy and resolution, as we see on the left. So the final level of detail that Microsoft adds to the game is to introduce handcrafted three-dimensional assets, so really created by an artist. Example there on the right, Paleis op de Dam in Amsterdam. And these handcrafted assets, or as Microsoft calls them, points of interest, are typically airports, very important for Flight Simulator obviously, natural features, or famous historical buildings and landmarks that you can recognize from the air. So that's the base game. But there's more, because Flight Simulator exists within a larger ecosystem. First of all, there's Microsoft itself, which regularly brings out free updates. These are different types. There's sim updates, which basically update the game engine and therefore the physics of the world. There are world updates, which focus on specific regions and then add new imagery, new photogrammetry, and new handcrafted assets to those locations. And also, for example, at the end of last year, we had the 40th anniversary edition, also playing with history, which added, amongst other things, additional historical aircraft for you to fly in the game. What you also see, where you also see these aircraft is in the paid DLC, which Microsoft also releases. They have different lines of paid DLC, mostly focusing on adding additional aircraft to the game. And you can see two of the lines are the local legends to tie in with world updates and the famous flyers. So these are all historical aircraft that you can purchase for the game. But it's not just Microsoft, because there's a whole legion of developers making, first of all, free updates to the game. To give a sense of scale, FlightSim.2 is one of the largest websites where you can find these add-ons, and they claim to have something like 50,000 add-ons available on their site in the 2 years since the release of the game. This ranges from basically reskins of aircraft that are already in the game to new aircraft, new scenery locations, landmarks, and so on. And quite unique for Flight Simulator is that there's also a whole cottage industry of payware, so paid third-party DLC developers who develop exclusively DLC for Flight Simulator. In the latest iteration, 2020, that has been integrated with an in-game marketplace, but this scene has existed for decades now, and there are also a variety of external marketplaces where you can buy these add-ons. All right, but how does all of this bring us to history? Well, the most obvious way of interacting with history in Flight Simulator is, of course, to interact with aviation history, and the most obvious way to do that is to fly in historical aircraft. The base game focused on contemporary aircraft, but in the 40th anniversary update, a whole bunch of historical aircraft were added, and then also via the paid DLC you can add a lot more historical aircraft again, depending on which ones catch your fancy. And this is not just about recreating the visuals, recreating a 3D model of the aircraft, but also really about recreating the flight behavior, the physics of the aircraft, and of the systems of that aircraft. Now, once you have this aircraft, of course, it's fun to fly it around, but you might also want to recreate some actual historical events in the game, which you can do. Some have been added in, so for example, there's a default activity you can do, you see on the top left there, where you recreate Charles Lindbergh's crossing of the Atlantic, staring at water for 34 hours and getting sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations is your idea of a fun time. Be my guest. But there are also more emergent gameplays that emerge. And one example is Two-Tone Murphy, who is a YouTuber and Twitch streamer. He hosted an online event recreating the airborne component of the D-Day landings, where something like 80 people joined in via multiplayer to fly this historical route in the historical aircraft and kind of recreate that scenario. Another example is another Twitch streamer, Alison Johnson, who focuses on recreating historical flights of famous female aviators. And, well, if you really want to master these historical aircraft and these historical events, you can also learn historical skills. For example, there's an add-on right there at FlightSim.2 that allows you to recreate the practice of celestial navigation in Flight Simulator. So navigating, simulating, using a sextant to measure the height of the sun or other celestial objects, and use that to work out what is your position in the world. Another example is from this Boeing 247 add-on aircraft, where you see point 6, one of the selling points is navigate like it's 1933. Right, so a real selling point is that you get to learn how to operate this obsolete navigation system, and we don't use anymore, and use that to navigate around instead of relying on GPS. So that's the aviation history. But we can also interact with non-aviation history, and that ties in actually very nicely with the theme of the previous session, because a lot of what you can do in Flight Simulator is explore the geographical context of various locations. So here you have an example of the pyramids, and of course you can go to Google, type in pyramids, look at pictures. But in Flight Simulator there are three-dimensional objects that exist in the world that you also exist in, and that you can interact with, that you can navigate to and fly around. And for example, here you can really appreciate that these pyramids are on top of a plateau overlooking this Nile Valley. And also what we see, to call back to the panel of yesterday, there is indeed that very stark division between the two biomes, which you can really see from this overview that it gives you. Another example is here. I don't know if anybody recognizes where this is. This is Thermopylae, which I had read about, of course, and absorbed via cultural osmosis, but it was not until I flew there myself in Flight Simulator that I really understood, yeah, that is a logical place to try and stop an invading army, because you have this narrow piece of land between mountains and sea. We can also zoom out with this geographical context, because rather than looking at specific locations or landmarks, we can also think about exploring entire famous voyages or routes, whether trade routes or pilgrimages, or look at the borders or other geographical locations between empires or states or whatever we want to examine. So on the left, I don't know how visible it is with the sun, but you see my exploration of the Silk Roads by aircraft. And on the right, you see some examples of what are called bush trips. These are pre-made flight paths that you can download and then follow in Flight Simulator. So these have been made as add-ons. And you see there, for example, a bush trip that allows you to follow the journey of Dr. Livingstone, or various bush trips guiding you around the Fertile Crescent or exploring biblical archaeology. Right? And you might say, well, can't we do all of this on a map? We have Google Earth, we have Google Maps, whatever. And yes, you can. But the difference is when you do it in Flight Simulator, you have to navigate yourself. You have to situate yourself in the world and in the context and say, okay, I'm here, I want to go there. What direction do I need to go and how far away is it? What landmarks should I look out for along the way to navigate there? So you get a much deeper, much more active understanding of the geographical context. And also calling back, for example, to the Hajj Trail, right, where it was about giving students that real feeling of what it meant, the travel time involved. Also in Flight Simulator, you cannot just teleport. Well, you can if you exit the game and select your starting location, right? But in principle, okay, a plane is much faster than a horse or a boat, but you really have to experience every kilometer of the journey to get from point A to point B. So, I had to fit it in 15 minutes, so it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but to summarize, in Flight Simulator we can interact with aviation history through flying historical aircraft, recreating historical events and learning historical skills. And we can interact with non-aviation history by exploring the geographical context, either of local areas or landmarks, or really of entire regions of the world, or recreating particular voyages or routes or other geographical connections. And more in general, I hope I've inspired you, or some of you have already realized, that history can also be found in non-historical games. And I hope that, well, maybe this is some inspiration for some of you to go looking for it, and hopefully at TIPC3 we'll be able to see what you found. Thank you very much.